Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. Elijah taken to heaven. There are no less than 3 important biblical characters who may have had contact with extraterrestrial beings. 2 of them were taken to heaven and were never seen again, and the third one witnessed what some say is evidence of spaceships on Earth. Let's first discuss Enoch. In the book of Genesis, it said that Adam lived for 930 years. Then his son Seth lived for 912 years, and Seth's son Enoch lived only 905 years. Lives continued to be shortened up until the time of Enoch, just before Noah and the flood. Enoch didn't die though, he was taken away. He lived a total of 365 years, and then, according to the book of Genesis, Enoch went with God, and then he was no more because God had taken him away. But the Bible never says where he went, only that he was taken and never returned to the planet. The same thing happened with the prophet Elijah. He and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal when the Lord took Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. And if you think that's insane, the story of Ezekiel is even more bizarre. He details an encounter with UFOs thousands of years ago. In the Bible, Ezekiel says that he saw a windstorm come up from the north. There was a great cloud of flashing lights, and at the center of the cloud were what looked like glowing hunks of metal. There was fire inside the cloud, and 4 living creatures in human form. This sounds an awful lot like spaceships, but what do you think? Let us know in the comments. Number 9. Noah's Space Ark. What if Noah was an alien and his ark was a spaceship? According to the Bible, before the days of Noah, the world was deep in depravity. God's creatures, the living things he'd created to occupy the earth, weren't behaving in the way he'd intended. His beloved creatures were being wicked, and they were corrupted by murder, greed, envy, lust, and plenty of other sins. But if you look at it from a more scientific angle, it almost sounds like a scientist being unhappy with his biological experiments. It seems like an advanced being created humans as part of an experiment, and after giving them free will, he was displeased with the way they acted. Then, when God, or the bioengineer from another planet, saw his creatures were hopeless, he sent a flood to wash them off the face of the earth. The story of the flood can be interpreted either way, but whether it was an omnipotent being named God or a group of aliens experimenting with a new race of intelligent apes, the ending was the same. Noah rounded up the natural animals in a vast ark and protected them until the flood waters receded. Then the architect got back to work, creating better humans. Noah's sons were supposedly responsible for repopulating society, but in order to fit all those animals in his ship, he would have needed an extremely large boat. What if he was one of the creators, and he used a massive spaceship to protect the planet's animals while human beings were reset? Number 8. The creepy angels. In the book of Genesis, the Nephilim are described as mighty men. They were a group of giants birthed by human women who were impregnated by corrupted angels. We get another description of them in the book of Numbers, in which the Nephilim are said to be so big that to them, ordinary humans look like grasshoppers. But by far the best description of these strange creatures comes from the book of Enoch. This book was allegedly written by the grandfather of Noah over 10,000 years ago. Enoch described how the angels were sent down to the realm of humans to look after them on behalf of God. However, instead of doing their jobs, the angels became lustful for human women, joining them in an unholy union. This act led to the creation of abominations, otherwise known as the Nephilim. They were huge giants that were so big they could crush ordinary people under their feet. They were half angel and half human, but they turned against humanity and tried to devour them. The Nephilim became so corrupt that they turned to cannibalism, drank one another's blood, and were just generally awful. If the Book of Enoch is to be believed, the Nephilim were primarily responsible for God flooding the planet. But just how real were the giants? In 1577, a collection of bones was found in Switzerland. They were so big that people believed they came from a biblical giant that stood 19 feet, 6 meters tall. However, in 1786, German scientist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach realized the skeleton belonged to a woolly mammoth. So, the unfortunate truth is that no official giant skeletons have ever been found. Number 7. Resurrection everywhere. Jesus Christ was hardly the only person to be raised from the dead in the Bible. In the Old and New Testaments, resurrections are a dime a dozen. It happens so frequently, you might think they had a bit of a zombie problem back then. The very first biblical account of someone being raised from the dead is the son of the widow in Zarephath. The widow's son gets sick, and his illness eats away at him from the inside. Then he dies. The widow blames Elijah and God for taking her son away, and so Elijah cries out to God and stretches himself over the boy's body. He asks God to give the child's life back, and God does exactly that. But there are plenty of other examples of God playing the role of necromancer. Lazarus is a perfect example. When Lazarus gets sick, his sisters send for Jesus to come and heal him. However, Lazarus dies anyway. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has already been dead for 4 days. Jesus goes to his tomb and tells whoever's guarding it to open it. Then Lazarus walks out from the tomb alive after being commanded by Jesus to return to the earth. Even Paul raised somebody from the dead in the book of Acts. As Paul speaks to a group of people about the gospel, a man named Eutychus falls 3 stories from a window after falling asleep, resulting in his death. Paul rushes through the crowd and throws his arms around the young man. He then proclaims that he's alive, and everyone that witnessed the miracle celebrates. Number 6. The War of Angels. The story of Lucifer's rebellion is told in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. In the book of Revelation, we learn of a war in heaven that was waged between the angels and the devil's army. The angels were led by the mighty archangel Michael, while Lucifer led the rebellion against God. The tale of Lucifer's fall comes in many different forms depending on where we are looking. In the Armenian, Georgian, and Latin versions of the story of Adam and Eve, Lucifer rebels after the creation of Adam. Lucifer doesn't wish to bow down to humans. It's even the same story in the Islamic version of the Bible. Iblis, the Islamic leader of the devils, refuses to bow down to Adam in the garden. Another version is that Lucifer refused to become a subject of God's son, and so he rebelled. But no matter what his motivation was, the story ends the same every single time. War was waged in heaven between Lucifer and Michael, along with all their respective angels, and in the end, Lucifer was defeated and cast down to hell. However, many biblical scholars believe the war in heaven was a sneaky reference to the spiritual warfare being fought in the early days of the church. It may have been a symbolic event that really happened, likely a reference to the war between paganism and Christianity. And now for number 5, but first it's shout-out time. We wanted to give a huge thank you to Paul Britt and Blender Study for watching and supporting Origins Explained. We really appreciate your feedback. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Number 5. Biblical time travel. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is notorious for having more forbidden books of the Bible included in their biblical canon than just about any other mainstream church. In one of these forbidden texts, for Baruch, there is what appears to be a tale of time travel. The text was taken out of the book of Jeremiah and is considered a fraud by everyone except the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. According to ancient astronaut theorist Eric von Daniken, the story is a biblical example of time travel. In the text it says that prophet Jeremiah is sitting with several of his friends, and with them is a young boy named Abimelech. Jeremiah tells the boy to leave Jerusalem, but tells him where he can find a hill covered in figs. He then orders the boy to collect the fresh figs and bring them back for him and his friends to eat. So the boy goes and collects the figs, but on his way back, Abimelech encounters something strange. There's suddenly a blast of noise around him, accompanied by a swirl of wind, and he blacks out. When he wakes up, he runs back to the city and finds it full of strange people. When Abimelech asks where Jeremiah is, an old man tells him that Jeremiah hasn't been around for 62 years. There are a handful of versions of the text, with Abimelech's sleep ranging from 60 to 70 years. Many biblical scholars have interpreted the time warp as representing the history of the Babylonian captivity. This was when Judeans were kept as slaves and prisoners of the Babylonians for about a century. However, others say Abimelech's story may have been a real example of accidental time travel. Number 4. The Dragon. There's a piece of the book of Daniel that was removed for not being authentic enough by the Catholic Church. The forbidden piece of text is called Bel and the Dragon. It was cut from the Protestant Bible, but it did make it into the King James Bible. The story is a strange one because some say it has to do with an ancient Mesopotamian deity called Marduk and his faithful dragon. In Mesopotamia, Marduk, son of Enki, was one of the most important gods, the equivalent of Zeus in the Greek pantheon. He was the patron god of Babylon and presided over justice, fairness, and compassion. He was also seen as the god of storms and was worshipped as the agricultural deity. His temple was likely the model for the biblical Tower of Babel. He also happened to have a monstrous reptile named the Meshusu dragon, which we can see depicted on the magnificent Ishtar Gate of Babylon, built around 575 BC. In Bel and the Dragon, Bel is a statue worshipped by the Mesopotamians meant to represent Marduk. Daniel goes about trying to convince the statue worshippers that they're doing the wrong thing by worshipping a false idol. In the end, though, the statue is destroyed and Daniel is thrown into a pit of lions. Number 3. The burning garbage dump. What if hell wasn't what you thought it was? Instead of being a fiery pit of damnation where you would go to burn for all of eternity, what if hell in the Bible was just referring to a garbage dump in ancient Jerusalem? The thing about the Bible is that it's full of secret meanings, metaphors, and vague analogies. Jesus may not have been warning people about a realm of fire and brimstone, but rather of a filthy burning garbage dump in Gehenna. In Matthew 5:29, Jesus warns that if a person sins, they'll go to hell. He says if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. Jesus warns that it's better to lose one part of your body than for all of you to be thrown into hell. However, the word hell in this context is a direct translation from the Greek word Gehenna. In ancient Jerusalem, Gehenna also happens to be the name of the place where they burned their garbage. Legend has it there was so much trash in Jerusalem being burned that the fire raged day and night. There's a chance that when Jesus warned that a person could wind up in hell, he really meant in a flaming garbage dump where they would suffer for all of eternity. Number 2. The horned Moses. Apparently, Moses had horns. There's no easier way to say it. The very man who received the 10 Commandments from God at the top of Mount Sinai in Egypt and returned the Israelites to the Promised Land had horns. All throughout the ancient world, Moses was depicted in art as having 2 horns sprouting from his head like the devil. One of the most famous of these depictions is Michelangelo's Moses, which today sits in the tomb of Pope Julius II in St. Peter's Basilica. For the last 2,000 years, people just kind of accepted that Moses had devil horns. But why in the world was this ever a thing? Historians say the idea of Moses having horns likely started with the Vulgate Bible. This was a Latin translation created by St. Jerome in the 4th century AD and would later become the Latin Bible up until 1979. It was arguably the most important Bible ever written. When St. Jerome was translating, he was likely a little confused on how to translate rays of light from Hebrew to Latin. Instead, he described Moses as having a horn, since it was fairly similar in shape. However, the terrible translation ended up giving Moses a pair of horns for the next few centuries. The translated Bible was mass-produced, and people just accepted that Moses had horns like a goat. Number 1. The Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark has one of the strangest endings of any biblical book. The narrative ends so abruptly that scholars doubt its authenticity. Many believe the current Gospel of Mark was somehow changed, and that the original version had a longer and more complete ending. It's as if somebody cut the author off in the middle of their sentence. It's especially jarring if you read the Gospel in one sitting from beginning to end. You get into the groove of it, then all of a sudden the ending throws you way off balance. The theory is that the final verses are not the original text, and that they may have been altered from what was originally written. The Gospel of Mark ends like this: "And they fled from the tomb, for fear and trembling had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." This is a reference to an event that happens after Jesus Christ is crucified. Mary Magdalene and her companions traveled to his tomb, only to find that his body had been removed. And there before them was a young man who none of them had ever seen before. He told them Jesus of Nazareth had risen, and that Mary should tell his disciples that he'd gone up to heaven. The Gospel then ends with Mary and her disciples leaving the tomb and saying nothing. It's an extremely odd ending, and many people suspect there's much more to it. But what happened to the original script if there was more at the end of the Gospel? At the moment, it seems to be a mystery. What's your favorite outrageous story from the Bible? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.